On March 3rd, 2020, in Akron, Ohio, Brenda went back home at noon to talk to her daughter after her husband, who was at work, informed her that their daughter was having problems at school and she was currently at home. A few minutes later, her husband was called by a detective and she was informed that his wife, Brenda, was attacked and she had been rushed to the hospital. His daughter had also been rushed to the hospital. A few hours later, his wife, Brenda, succumbed to her injuries while receiving treatment at the hospital. Brenda was a 50-year-old woman, a loving mother, and a kind-hearted individual. Who murdered Brenda Powell? Let us look at her story as the police investigate her daughter, Sydney Powell, so that they can know what happened that day. Sydney Powell was born in the year 2000 to Steve Powell and Brenda Powell. She was the eldest child, and she had two siblings behind her. Her younger brother was known as Andrew. The family lived in Akron, Ohio, and they lived a normal life. Sydney's mother worked at the Children's Hospital in the cancer unit. She worked there for many years. Brenda actually had a heart of gold. She was so kind-hearted and giving. She was so close to her daughter, Sydney, and people knew them as best of friends. They would hang out every day, and when Sydney would go off to college, they would talk to each other every day. At school, Sydney was a very bright student who always performed well at her studies. She was very open, and outgoing, and people really loved to be around her. However, to the people she was not familiar with, she was a quiet and a very shy girl. Apart from her studies, she also played soccer, and she was really a wonderful player. In the year 2018, Sydney graduated from high school as an honor roll student. Because she got a good grade at high school, she enrolled at the University of Mount Union. The college was only 45 minutes away from her home, so her parents were comfortable with her being close to them. Sydney Powell was able to receive a scholarship, so her first semester went on smoothly because the scholarship paid for her tuition, books, among other things. Therefore, her parents had a lesser burden spending on her studies. Sydney was also able to get a dorm room with her childhood best friend, Lauren. They were very excited and they ended up joining a sorority so that they could have all of the college experience. Their college would usually break up during winter or spring or summer, but Sydney was having so much fun at the college that she rarely went home. Sydney had a great first year at the University of Mount Union, and she was excited to start her second year in the fall of 2019. On January 2020, Sydney's father tried to log into her portal so that he can pay the bills, but he was logged out. So he reached out to his daughter and asked her why he couldn't log into her portal. Sydney told him that there might be a problem, so she would go to the office to find out what was the issue with the website. She promised to get back to him. However, by March 3rd, her father was still not able to gain access to the portal, and since still Sydney hadn't had it fixed. Steve decided to call the school. Unfortunately, when he called the school, he was informed that his daughter was no longer enrolled in that learning institution. Steve was so shocked, and he began asking questions. However, the college management cut him short and advised him to talk to the student since they can't give him that information. Steve was shocked because he had no idea that his daughter was having problems in school. Even though he was at work when he checked his phone to see his daughter's location on the Life 360 app, he was surprised when the app showed that Sydney was at home. So, he decided to leave work early, and he would also leave his phone at work. He knew that in this way, if Sydney looked at the 360 app to see where he was, she would believe that he was still at work. After leaving work, he arrived at his house at around 11:30 a.m. and found Sydney. He then sat her down, looked at her in the eye, and asked her what was going on. That was when Sydney told him that she had been put on academic suspension after failing 3 or 4 times in different classes. This was a secret that she had been hiding from everyone, including her best friend, Lauren, who was also her roommate. The school rules and regulations required that if a student had been put on an academic suspension, he or she is supposed to move out of your dorm, and you are not allowed to attend classes or school functions. In order for Sydney to hide the fact that she had been suspended, she decided to remain in the dorm with her friend, Lauren. She also attended some of the classes in order to pretend that she was still schooling there. She did all of this to cover up her lies. But unfortunately, the school administration found out what she had been doing, and on February 24th, security staff are called to send her away. Unfortunately, instead of Sydney informing her parents that she had been suspended, she took some of the money she had and she rented an hotel room. Unfortunately, on March 3rd, she ran out of money, so she returned home. Sydney told her father that she felt lost at school because she didn't know what she wanted to do for a career, and this made taking classes very difficult for her. Her father understood her and promised that they will see what they can do to help her. So he left and went back to work. At work, he called his wife Brenda and informed her about what was going on with their daughter Sydney. She told her that they needed to discuss about their daughter when she comes back from work. So she clocked out and she headed home. When she got into the driveway at 12:15 p.m., she called her husband and told him that she was already ready home. She then asked him what was going on. Steve told her a little bit about what was going on with their daughter, Sydney. When Brenda heard about what was going on with Sydney, she got upset, and so she called at her college. At 12:36 p.m., she texted Steve and told her that she was waiting for the college to call her back. 5 minutes later, Steve texted Brenda back, asking her if she had talked to Sydney about the college situation. Unfortunately, his wife, Brenda, never responded. Unfortunately, 10 minutes later, that was at about 12:51 p.m., one of Steve's friend, who was a detective by the name Kenneth Deese from Akron Police Department, called him. When Steve picked up the call, his friend told him that he had heard over the police radio that police have been dispatched to his home. Steve panicked, and he called his wife, Brenda, over and over, but she never responded. He also called his daughter, Sydney, over and over, but she was also not picking up her calls. At last, Sydney answered his father's call and told him that there had been a break-in at the house. When the police officers went around back, and this is when they saw a broken window that had blood on it. When they went inside the house, they saw Sydney hysterically crying on the ground. She showed them the body of a woman lying down and tells them that she was her mother. There was so much blood at the scene, so the officers get her out to secure the scene. They question her about what happened. Sydney tells them that her mother told her to get out. However, a few minutes later, she heard her screaming. When she came back, she found her lying on the ground. The officer noted down when Sydney said she a bong. Then there was a big broken. They then asked her if she was cut. She had a cut on her hand. So both Sydney and her mother were transported to Akron Medical Hospital so that they can get treatment for their injuries. At the hospital, Sydney's wounds were treated and she was getting better, but unfortunately her mother Brenda succumbed to her injuries. When her body was taken for an autopsy, it was revealed that Brenda had been hit on the head multiple times with a cast iron skillet and then also stabbed with a steak knife. The coroner also revealed that Brenda had 30 puncture wounds to her neck. The investigators working on the case revealed that the house, which was now a crime scene, looked like there was a struggle, and they were suspicious of Sydney after noticing that she had cuts on her and that the window had been broken from the inside. As the investigations continued, things were not making any sense for the detectives. Sydney had earlier on said that somebody had broken into the home. However, when the detectives did their investigations, they discovered that window was broken from the inside and not from the outside. They failed to understand why Sydney had all of those cuts on her, and so she became their prime suspect. So on the evening of April 6, 2020, Sydney was arrested by the police, and she was charged with the murder of her mother, Brenda Powell. She was taken to a psychiatric facility for a 72-hour evaluation where she was diagnosed as suffering from a psychotic episode. She was then moved to a psychiatric hospital where 2 psychiatrists describe her as in the throes of a first episode of schizophrenia. Dr. James Reardon evaluated Sydney. He diagnosed her with schizophrenia and a major depressive disorder. According to Reardon, Sydney was losing her grip on reality for months leading up to the attack, suffering from both visual and auditory hallucinations. On April 17th, Sydney was released on a $25,000 bond, which was paid by her maternal grandmother. After her maternal grandmother had bailed her out, she took her in, and so Sydney went to live with her while she waited to go to trial. More witnesses kept on coming. A woman named Michelle Gaffney, who was the Associate Dean of Students, and a man named John Fraser, who was Dean of Students, came up as witnesses. Michelle told the detectives that she was on the phone with Brenda, who was Sydney's mother, on the day of the incident. She said she was trying to explain to Brenda the situation which her daughter was in at school. The phone was on speakerphone, and she was with John Fraser in the room as they talked to Brenda. They heard about 6 or 7 loud thuds, followed by a loud scream. The other sound they heard was of the expulsion of air. This was as if air had been knocked out of somebody. After that, Brenda went silent. She was not responding to her calls. They asked her if she was okay, but there was no reply. Michelle said that John and the other dean were very concerned after hearing that, so they went ahead and called one of the dispatchers to go over to the house to check on Brenda. Michelle said that in the meantime, they called Brenda's phone back, trying to make sure that she was okay. After they called her 3 to 4 times, a woman picked up the call and said hello. That is when John, who was the other dean, said, "Brenda, is that you?" The female voice on the other end of the phone said, "Yes, this is me." Now, Michelle then said that her and John both looked at each other and shook their heads like they knew that that was not Brenda. So then John said to the voice on the phone, "Sydney, I know this is you. This is not Brenda." And then the phone went click, and the person on the phone hung up. The evidences were overwhelming, and her trial commenced on September 7th, 2023. Sydney pleaded not guilty by reasons of insanity. Her defense claimed that she had a psychotic break. Her father, Steve, and her maternal grandmother, Betsy, pleaded with the prosecutors to reach a resolution without a trial. Unfortunately, the prosecutors refused to grant their refused and told them that they wanted a jury to decide. Sydney's maternal grandmother testified in her defense. She claimed that her granddaughter, Sydney, she claimed that she had changed after being put on medication after she got out of Akron General Medical Center. During the trial, her childhood friend, Lauren, testified that Sydney was very normal leading up to the incident. During the 12 days trial, the prosecution were able to prove that Sydney hit her mother, Brenda, over and over again with a cast iron skillet and tried to cover it up by pretending that the incident was a break-in. The prosecutors gave a body cam footage, and the jurors were able to see how Sydney was attacking her mother using a cast iron skillet. The prosecutors maintained that Sydney knew what she was doing and that she didn't have psychotic break. The prosecutor said that when people have a psychotic break, they doesn't realize that what they did was wrong. But in this case, Sydney realized that what she did to her mother was wrong, and she tried to cover the incident and lied about what happened to her mother. Sydney's defense had 3 experts who testified that they had diagnosed Sydney with schizophrenia. One of the experts said that in the 3 months leading up to the incident, Sydney was losing her sense of reality and trying to keep up with all of her lies. Unfortunately, Sylvia Obradovich, a psychologist for the prosecution, disagreed with the experts and said that Sydney didn't meet the legal definition of insanity at the time of the crime. However, the Sylvia acknowledged that Sydney suffered from mental health issues, including borderline personality traits, malingering, and anxiety disorder. On September 20th, 2023, the jury found Sydney Powell guilty for the murder of her mother, Brenda Powell, guilty of felonious assault and tampering with the evidence. She was sentenced to 15 years life in prison, and she was to serve her sentence in the Ohio Department of Corrections. On count 4 of the indictment, Sydney was sentenced to 3 years in prison in the Ohio Department of Corrections, and the 2 sentences were to be run concurrent with and not consecutive to each other. When Sydney was given a chance to speak at the trial, her attorney instructed her not speak because they were going to appeal the verdict.